May 1945. The war in Europe had been over for less than 2 weeks. The surrender documents had been signed, the guns had gone quiet, and across a broken continent, the long, unglamorous work of accounting for the living had begun. In processing camps from the Rhine to the Rhone, soldiers who had spent years learning how to fight were now learning how to file paperwork. Among the millions being counted, categorized, and assigned a number were the women, auxiliaries, clerks, teachers, administrators, who had served the collapsed order and now stood on the other side of it, waiting to find out what came next. The truck stopped at the gate of the holding facility just before noon. It had been a long drive from the collection point near the German border, 7 hours on roads that alternated between smooth Allied-maintained stretches and the broken, patched surfaces of towns that had spent the last year under artillery fire. Kathy Vogel had spent most of those 7 hours looking out through the gap in the canvas at the passing French countryside, cataloging what she saw with the particular attention of someone who has decided that observation is the only form of control still available to her. The fields were green. That was the first thing. After the gray-brown exhaustion of Germany in the final months, the burned edges of everything, the dust and the rubble, and the particular color of a landscape that has been fought over until it has nothing left to give. The green of the French countryside in May felt almost aggressive. Farms with intact roofs, orchards beginning to flower, villages where the walls were still standing and the windows still held glass. The war had passed through here, but it had not consumed everything the way it had consumed the places she knew. She filed this away without drawing conclusions from it. Not yet. Her name was Kathy Vogel, 31 years old. Born in Dresden in the autumn of 1913, the eldest daughter of a literature professor and a woman who had run the household and the professor's professional correspondence with equal precision. She had grown up in a home full of books and structured argument, where dinner conversations required you to support your positions and vague sentiment was treated with gentle but firm skepticism. She had become a schoolteacher, secondary school, literature and history, in a Dresden gymnasium where she had taught for 6 years with the kind of focused dedication that her students recognized as genuine even when they found her demanding. She had believed in the importance of what she taught, not just the content, but the underlying principle that a well-organized mind, trained to think carefully and speak precisely, was the foundation of everything a serious society required. She had also believed in the order that had come to power when she was 19 years old. She would not pretend otherwise, even now, even here, even sitting in the back of an Allied truck with a prisoner number on a card around her neck. She had believed in it the way an intelligent person believes in something that appears to solve the problem they have been watching go unsolved, not blindly, not without reservation, but with the considered conviction of someone who has weighed the alternatives and found them wanting. The years had complicated that conviction. The war had complicated it further. But conviction, once built into the structure of how you understand the world, does not dissolve simply because the world has changed. It requires something more than changed circumstances. It requires a specific, undeniable encounter with a reality it cannot accommodate. She had not had that encounter yet. She was still waiting to be proven right about what she expected to find here. The facility was a converted agricultural estate on the outskirts of a small town whose name she did not yet know. The main building was a large stone farmhouse, solid and old, with outbuildings that had been repurposed into administrative offices and sleeping quarters. The yard was packed gravel, clean and well-maintained. American flags hung at the gate and above the main entrance, their colors bright in the May sunshine. There were perhaps 40 women in the group that climbed down from the trucks. Clerks, nurses, a handful of teachers like herself, several women whose previous roles she could not determine from appearance alone. They assembled in the yard with the careful posture of people who are uncertain what is about to happen and have decided that visible composure is the best available response to uncertainty. The American soldiers who met them were younger than Kathy had expected. Most were in their early 20s, some visibly younger. Boys from places she had never heard of, wearing uniforms that were well-made and well-maintained in a way that spoke of a supply chain that had not been interrupted by the last 4 years of total war. They moved with the easy, unhurried confidence of people who had won and knew it, but without the cruelty she had been prepared for. Their voices were low. Their instructions were delivered through a German-speaking corporal in a tone that was impersonal without being hostile. Form a line. Have your identification ready. You will be processed in order. No one will be harmed. Kathy stood in the line and listened and noted, in the careful inventory she had been keeping since the truck left the collection point, that the soldiers were not looking at the women the way she had been told enemy soldiers looked at female prisoners. They were looking at them the way administrators look at a queue, as a logistical reality requiring orderly management rather than an opportunity for anything else. She did not allow this to mean anything yet. One afternoon of professional conduct proved nothing. Systems maintained their surfaces longest in public moments, at the point of first contact, when behavior was most likely to be observed. The real character of a place showed itself later, in the unguarded hours, in the gap between official procedure and private action. She would wait. She was good at waiting. Processing took the better part of the afternoon. Each woman was called to a table where a soldier recorded her details, name, date of birth, occupation, last assigned location, with the methodical patience of someone working through a long list. Kathy answered each question in the precise, careful German she used for everything, watching the corporal translate her words into the form the soldier typed. The soldier was perhaps 22 years old, with the beginning of a sunburn across his nose and the distracted efficiency of someone who had been doing this particular task since early morning and was aware there were many more names to go. He did not look at her with contempt. He did not look at her with anything much, just the neutral, task-focused attention of someone doing their job. When he finished entering her information, he checked it against what he had typed, handed her a copy of her prisoner registration card, and said something to the corporal that was rendered as, "Next building on the left for medical screening. Someone will show you where." That was all. She took the card and walked in the indicated direction and thought about what had just happened, which was nothing remarkable, nothing threatening, nothing that matched any version of what she had been told to expect. Just a young man with a sunburned nose typing a form on a Tuesday afternoon in May, treating the process of registering an enemy prisoner with the same attention he would presumably bring to any other administrative task that needed completing before the end of the day. She thought, this is surface. This is protocol. Wait. She walked to the next building. That evening the women were shown to their sleeping quarters, a long room in one of the converted outbuildings, with cots arranged in 2 rows, a blanket folded at the foot of each one. The room was clean. The window at the far end was open, letting in the mild May air and the sound of birds in the trees outside the fence. Ordinary birds, making ordinary sounds, indifferent to the fact that the world had just reorganized itself around a different set of borders. Kathy chose a cot near the window. She sat on the edge of it and looked at the blanket. It was wool, slightly rough, the kind of practical, durable object that a well-organized military supply system produced in large quantities without particular concern for comfort, but with consistent attention to function. She thought about Dresden, about the school where she had taught, which she had heard from another woman in the convoy was no longer standing, about her apartment on the 3rd floor of a building near the Elbe, where she had kept her father's books after he died, and where she had spent the evenings of the last 6 years grading papers and preparing lessons and reading and living the ordered, purposeful life of a person who believed she understood what she was part of and why it mattered. She thought about Klaus, her younger brother, 20 years old, drafted in February, sent to the Western Front in March, last heard from in a letter postmarked from somewhere in the Rhineland that had arrived in early April and said almost nothing, that he was cold, that he was managing, that she should not worry. She had not heard from him since. The Red Cross lists were overwhelmed. The communication systems had collapsed along with everything else. She did not know if he was alive. She did not speak about this to anyone. She had not spoken about it since his disappearance. Speaking about it would require acknowledging the full weight of it, and the full weight of it was not something she could afford to carry openly in addition to everything else. So she kept it where she had always kept the things that were too large for the available space, compressed, contained, stored in a part of herself that she did not open unless she was alone and the night was quiet enough to bear it. Tonight, with the birds outside the window and the other women settling onto their cots around her, she allowed herself to think his name once. Klaus. Then she folded the blanket back, lay down, and looked at the ceiling until the light faded and the room filled with the breathing of sleeping women and the sound of the French countryside settling into its indifferent, beautiful night. She did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept without waking. And in the morning, what she had been waiting for, the evidence that would confirm what she already believed, was still nowhere to be found. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Also, I'd love to know which part of the US you're watching from. Let me know in the comments below. The days organized themselves quickly, the way days do inside institutions that run on schedules. Morning bell at 6:30. Washing at the outdoor basins. Cold water, clean towels. The particular luxury of soap that smelled like soap rather than the ersatz blocks that had replaced it in Germany sometime in 1943. Breakfast at 7. Work assignments at 8. The middle hours of the day in whatever task had been allocated. Administrative sorting, kitchen assistance, laundry, light maintenance of the outbuildings. Evening meal at 6. Lights at 9:30. Kathy moved through this rhythm with the deliberate composure of a woman who has decided that routine is the most dignified response to a situation she did not choose. She completed her assigned tasks, sorting administrative forms in a room adjacent to the main office, cross-referencing prisoner numbers against intake records, with the focused precision that had made her an effective teacher and now made her a useful clerk. The American corporal who supervised the administrative room, a young man from somewhere called Minnesota, whose German was serviceable if accented, told her on the third day that her work was accurate and that she could be trusted with more complex filing. She said thank you in careful English and returned to her forms and did not allow herself to think about what it meant that she was being trusted by an enemy administrator in an occupied country with the organizational records of her own captivity. She observed everything. She was always observing. The mess hall was the first sustained challenge to her explanations. It was a large room in the main building, long tables, wooden benches, windows along one wall that let in the morning light. It served perhaps 120 people, the German women held at the facility, the American administrative staff, and the rotating soldiers who passed through on various assignments. Everyone ate in the same room, at the same tables, from the same kitchen. This itself was not what she had expected. She had anticipated segregation, a system that expressed the hierarchy of captor and prisoner through the physical separation of where each group ate and what each group received. Instead, the arrangement was simply practical. One kitchen, one serving line, one room large enough to hold everyone. The German women received the same food as the American personnel. She verified this carefully, watching what was placed on trays at different points in the line, comparing portions, checking whether the quality changed depending on who was holding the tray. It did not change. Breakfast on the first morning had been oatmeal, bread, butter, and coffee. Real butter, not the thin margarine substitute that had become the default in Germany long before the final collapse. Real coffee, not the grain-based imitation that had replaced it. The oatmeal was thick and hot, and served in quantities that assumed a person eating it had not been rationing their appetite for the past 2 years. Kathy ate slowly, methodically, the way she had learned to eat during the scarcity years, small bites, measured pace, the ingrained habit of making food last, because the habit of plenty had been replaced so gradually that its absence had become the baseline. Around her, American soldiers ate with the casual ease of people for whom this breakfast was unremarkable. One poured himself a second cup of coffee without hesitation, the way you refill a cup when the cup is empty and more coffee is simply available. She watched him do this. She thought. The official version said they were running short. That the effort was costing them more than they could sustain. That their abundance was borrowed and the debt was coming due. The soldier refilled his cup and went back to his conversation. She looked down at her own food and continued eating and stored the observation beside the other observations she was collecting, the clean facility, the maintained trucks in the yard, the supply deliveries that arrived on a regular schedule with a consistency that spoke of a logistics system that had not been interrupted by anything in recent memory. The supply deliveries became a small, recurring education. Every Tuesday and Friday a truck arrived from the regional depot. Kathy could see it from the window of the administrative room where she worked. A large canvas-covered vehicle that backed up to the warehouse on the far side of the yard with the practiced ease of routine. 2 soldiers unloaded while a third checked items against a clipboard. Everything was counted, verified, signed for, stored. She began paying attention to what came off the truck. Flour, sugar, coffee, not in small quantities but in sacks that required 2 men to carry. Tinned meat, fresh vegetables when the season provided them, which in late May meant increasing variety. Carrots, onions, the first of the summer produce beginning to appear. Medical supplies in sealed boxes. Soap, cleaning materials, replacement linens. Once, a crate of oranges that the warehouse soldier opened to check the contents, glanced at, and directed to be stacked with the other stores without any visible awareness that fruit in these quantities might be considered remarkable. She watched this from the window and thought about the last winter in Dresden, about the ration cards that covered less and less of what they were supposed to cover, about the particular mental arithmetic of scarcity, calculating what remained, what could be substituted, what could be cut without the cutting becoming visible in the faces of the children she taught, who were already thinner than children should be and who brought lunches to school that she had learned not to look at too directly, because looking directly at them required acknowledging things she was not yet ready to acknowledge. She thought about the official explanation for the scarcity, that Germany was bearing the necessary cost of a necessary war. That sacrifice now meant abundance later, that the tightening was temporary, a function of the effort required, and that once the effort succeeded the tightening would end and what had been sacrificed would be returned. She looked at the crate of oranges being stacked in the warehouse. She thought, they were not sacrificing. They were not tightening. They were operating at a level of material sufficiency that we were told was impossible for them. We were told their system was failing. That is not what a failing system looks like. She turned back to her forms. She typed. She did not say anything to the corporal from Minnesota, who was working through his own stack of papers with the comfortable efficiency of a man who had never had reason to question whether the lights would work or the truck would arrive. There was a woman in the facility named Burgett, a former nurse from Hamburg, perhaps 40 years old, with the practical directness of someone who had spent years in medical settings where sentiment was a luxury and clarity was a professional requirement. She had attached herself to Kathy in the first days with the matter-of-fact ease of a person who identifies a compatible temperament and acts on the identification without ceremony. They sat together at meals, walked the perimeter of the yard in the evenings when the weather allowed, spoke in the careful, measured way of two intelligent women who were both still deciding how much to say and to whom. On a Thursday evening in the third week, sitting on a low wall at the edge of the yard with the last of the daylight still pale above the French fields, Burgett said, "I have been trying to find the place where the performance ends." Kathy looked at her. The kindness, Burgett continued. The food, the soap, the professional manner. I have been waiting for the moment when the real version appears underneath it. 3 weeks now. And, Kathy said, though she already knew because she had been conducting the same investigation with the same result. Burgett was quiet for a moment. A truck moved somewhere on the road beyond the fence, its engine fading into the distance. The birds in the trees at the edge of the property were beginning their evening noise, indifferent and unhurried. I think it might be genuine, Burgett said. Not with satisfaction. With the careful, slightly reluctant tone of someone reporting a result they did not expect and are not yet sure what to do with. I think this might simply be what they are. Kathy said nothing. She looked out at the French fields, green and calm in the evening light, and thought about the truck with the oranges and the soldier refilling his coffee cup and the administrative room where no one had raised a voice or made a threat in 3 weeks of shared working hours. She thought about the explanation she had been maintaining, that this was surface, performance, protocol, the careful presentation of a humane face designed to serve some strategic purpose she had not yet identified. She had been holding that explanation carefully, tending it, adding qualifications whenever the evidence pressed against it too hard. She could feel it beginning to cost more than it was worth. She was not ready to let it go. Not yet. One more layer of the armor was still in place. She would keep it there until something forced her to choose between the armor and the truth of what she was seeing. She did not know yet that the something was coming. She did not know it would arrive on a rainy afternoon, in the form of a private named Cole and a broken cart belonging to an old man he had never met. Perhaps, she said finally, in answer to Burgett. She stood up from the wall and walked back toward the barracks. Behind her, the French evening settled into its quiet, indifferent dark. It rained on a Wednesday. Not the violent, dramatic rain of summer storms, but the steady, patient rain of a European June that has decided to make its point slowly. A gray sky settling low over the fields, a fine persistent drizzle that soaked everything gradually and without apology. The yard of the facility turned dark and slick. The gravel darkened. The trees at the perimeter dripped steadily into the wet grass beneath them. Work assignments continued regardless. The administrative room where Kathy's sorted forms stayed dry and warm, heated by a small iron stove in the corner that the corporal from Minnesota fed with wood from a pile stacked against the outside wall. She typed. She filed. She watched the rain move across the window in slow diagonal lines and thought about Dresden in June, which had always been her favorite month in the city. The Elbe green and full, the lindens in flower along the promenades, the particular quality of light on wet stone that made even ordinary streets look like something worth remembering. Dresden in June was gone. The version of it she was remembering no longer existed in any form she could return to. She knew this with the flat, factual certainty of someone who has accepted a loss not because it has stopped hurting, but because continued resistance to the fact of it serves no practical purpose. She turned back to her forms. It was mid-morning when she heard the commotion on the road. The administrative building sat close enough to the facility's main gate that sounds from the road outside carried through the window when the rain eased slightly, which it did, for a stretch of perhaps 20 minutes around 10 o'clock, settling into a pause that left everything wet and still and quiet enough to hear what was happening beyond the fence. What was happening was this. A cart had broken down. She could see it from the window if she leaned slightly to the left. An old wooden cart of the kind French farmers had used for generations, pulled by a single horse, now stopped at an angle across the narrow road, perhaps 30 meters from the facility gate. One of the rear wheels had come partially off its axle. The cart was tilted, its load of wooden crates shifted to one side. The horse standing patiently in the traces with the calm resignation of an animal that has learned that humans and their equipment are frequently unreliable. The owner of the cart was an elderly man, perhaps 70 years old, small and thin in a dark coat, standing in the road looking at the wheel with the expression of someone assessing a problem that is beyond their immediate capacity to solve alone. He had tools. A wrench, a wooden block for leverage. He crouched beside the wheel and applied the wrench and achieved nothing, the axle refusing to cooperate, the cart remaining at its uncomfortable angle in the middle of the road. Kathy watched this for a moment with the detached attention of someone observing something that does not concern them. Then the gate of the facility opened. The soldier who came through the gate was young, perhaps 20 years old, with the broad-shouldered build of someone who had grown up doing physical work and the unhurried stride of a man going somewhere with a specific purpose. He wore his standard uniform, no rain gear, and within 30 seconds of stepping outside the gate the drizzle had begun again and his jacket was darkening with it. His name, she would learn later, was Private First Class Cole, from a town in Ohio she had never heard of. He had been on gate duty that morning, which meant he had been standing inside the guardhouse watching the same broken cart she had been watching from the administrative window. He walked directly to the old man. He said something in French, limited, halting French, the French of a young American who had learned perhaps 24 words of the language since arriving in the country and was deploying all of them now with complete unselfconscious commitment. The old man looked up from the wheel. He looked at the soldier with the particular wariness of a French civilian who had spent 4 years learning that uniformed men stopping to talk to you on the road were not always stopping for reasons that worked in your favor. Cole crouched down beside the wheel. He examined the axle. He stood, went back through the gate. Kathy lost sight of him for perhaps 3 minutes, and returned carrying a wooden block, a heavier wrench than the old man had, and a length of rope. He set these down beside the wheel with the organized efficiency of someone who has assessed what the problem requires and gone to get it. Then he got to work. Kathy stopped typing. She sat at her desk and watched through the window and did not look away. The rain had settled back into its steady, patient rhythm. Cole was crouched beside the rear wheel of the cart, working the larger wrench against the axle fitting while the old man held the wooden block in place as a brace. Neither of them spoke much. The language gap made conversation impractical, and the work made it unnecessary. They communicated in the efficient shorthand of two people solving a physical problem together. A gesture, a nod, the instinctive coordination of hands working toward the same immediate goal. The axle did not cooperate immediately. Cole adjusted his angle. Tried again. The fitting moved slightly, then stuck. He stood, repositioned the block, crouched back down. The old man said something. Cole responded with one of his 20 French words and what appeared to be a small laugh. Not at the old man, but at the situation, at the stubbornness of the axle, at the particular comedy of a piece of metal that has decided to be uncooperative in the rain on a Wednesday morning in June. The old man's expression shifted slightly. The wariness did not disappear entirely. It had been built by too many years to dissolve in 10 minutes. But something underneath it eased. He repositioned his hands on the wooden block and leaned into it with more commitment. Kathy watched. She was aware, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was watching something her framework had told her she would not see. Her framework had been specific on this point. Americans were transactional. They calculated. They helped when helping served a purpose, when there was an audience, when there was a benefit, when the help could be converted into something they wanted. Generosity without return was not a characteristic the official version of this country had included in its description. You could not be a people built on commerce and appetite, and also be people who stopped in the rain for an old man's broken cart without being asked, and without any mechanism for being rewarded. The framework could not accommodate what she was watching. She watched anyway. 40 minutes. That was how long it took. 40 minutes in the persistent French rain. Cole's jacket soaked through within the first 10, his boots dark with water, the work requiring 3 separate attempts at the axle fitting before the combination of the heavier wrench and the rope used as a secondary lever finally persuaded the metal to move. When the wheel seated properly on the axle and the cart leveled itself and the horse shifted its weight with mild approval, Cole stood and tested the wheel by hand, rotating it, checking the fitting, verifying that it would hold before the old man trusted it with his weight and his cargo on the road. It held. The old man stood and looked at the wheel and then at Cole. He said something. A full sentence this time, not the abbreviated exchanges of the working period. His voice was quiet. His expression was the expression of someone who has just received something they were not prepared to receive and is not entirely sure how to carry it. Cole said something back. One of his French words, probably. Then he picked up his tools, the rope, the wooden block, the heavy wrench, and he walked back through the gate of the facility without looking back, without waiting for any further acknowledgement, without any visible awareness that what he had just done was anything other than the obvious response to a situation that had presented itself on a Wednesday morning when he happened to be standing at the gate. The old man stood in the road for a moment, looking at the gate. Then he climbed back onto his cart and clicked to his horse and drove away down the wet road in the direction he had been going. Kathy sat at her desk for a long time after they were both gone. The rain continued. The forms on her desk waited. The corporal from Minnesota was working through something at the other end of the room and had not seen what she had seen, or perhaps had seen it and found nothing in it worth pausing for, which was itself a piece of information she did not know what to do with. She thought about the 40 minutes. She thought about the soaked jacket and the 3 attempts at the axle and the small laugh at the stubbornness of the metal. She thought about the old man's expression, the wariness giving way to something else, not gratitude exactly. More like the careful, reluctant recognition of someone who has just been given evidence that contradicts a conclusion they reach for good reasons and are not sure they are ready to revise. She recognized that expression. She was wearing it herself. She thought about the explanation she had been maintaining for 6 weeks. The one that said, surface, performance, protocol, strategy. The one that had served her through the clean facility and the adequate food and the professional manner and the supply truck with its unremarkable abundance. The one she had been tending carefully, adding qualifications to whenever the evidence pressed too hard. She looked at the empty road through the window. Private Cole had not known she was watching. The gate of the facility faced away from the administrative building window. He would have had to turn and look specifically in her direction to know that anyone inside was observing him. He had not turned. He had not looked. He had worked on the wheel for 40 minutes in the rain and then walked back through the gate with his tools, and that had been the end of it, as far as he was concerned. A problem on the road. A person who needed help. The obvious response. Nobody had ordered him to. Nobody had been watching him do it. Or rather, nobody whose opinion he was managing. Nobody whose judgment he needed to perform for. The old man was a French civilian with no authority over anything that affected Cole's situation. Helping him cost 40 minutes and a wet jacket, and nothing else would be gained from it. No record made. No credit assigned. He had done it because it was the thing to do. That was the part she could not find an explanation for that cost less than admitting what it actually was. She had been told this country was self-interested at its core. That generosity was a surface over appetite. That kindness was a currency spent only when a return was anticipated. She had believed this because it had been presented to her as analysis rather than propaganda. The sober assessment of a nation's true character beneath its stated values. The realistic view that cut through the idealism to the transaction underneath. She looked at the empty road. There had been no transaction. There had been an old man and a broken wheel and a young soldier from Ohio who had gone to get a heavier wrench. The explanation she had been maintaining for 6 weeks finally gave way. Not loudly. Not with the drama of a sudden collapse. More like the way a wall gives way when the foundation beneath it has been quietly compromised for too long. A settling. A subsidence. A gradual acknowledgement that the structure is no longer standing on what it appeared to be standing on. She turned back to her desk. She picked up the next form. She typed. But something behind her ribs had shifted, quietly, and without her permission, and she knew with the particular certainty of a precise mind that has finally encountered a fact it cannot reframe, that it was not going back to where it had been. That evening she sat on the low wall with Burgett and said nothing for a long time. Burgett, who had learned in 3 weeks to read the quality of Kathy's silences, waited. Finally Kathy said, "I saw something today." "What?" "A soldier fixed a broken cart for an old man. In the rain. For 40 minutes. No one asked him to. No one was watching. He went and got better tools and he fixed it, and then he went back inside." Burgett was quiet. "I have been looking for the transaction," Kathy said. "The thing underneath the kindness. The real reason. I have been looking for 6 weeks. Did you find it?" Kathy looked at the French fields, dark now in the early evening. The rain finally stopped, the air clean and cool and smelling of wet earth and grass. "No," she said. "I did not find it." Burgett nodded slowly. She did not say "I told you." She did not say anything that would make the moment about being right. She simply sat beside Kathy on the low wall and looked at the same fields and let the silence be what it needed to be. After a while, Kathy said, "I need to write to the Red Cross again about Klaus." "Yes," Burgett said. "You do." They sat until the light was gone. Then they walked back to the barracks together, through the clean wet air of a French evening, and did not say anything more. The days after the cart were different. Not visibly. Not in any way that another person watching her would have identified as change. She still arrived at the administrative room at 8 o'clock. Still sorted forms with the same precision. Still cross-referenced numbers with the same focused attention, still responded to the corporal from Minnesota's occasional questions with the same careful, limited English she had been building week by week. From the outside, Kathy Vogel looked exactly as she had always looked, composed, controlled, purposeful, a woman who had decided that competence was the most dignified response to circumstances she had not chosen. But inside, something had been rearranged. She was aware of it the way you are aware of furniture moved in a room you know very well. Nothing is missing, everything is technically still present, but the spatial relationships have changed and your body keeps expecting things to be where they used to be and finding them somewhere else. The framework she had maintained for 31 years, the one that organized the world into what was strong and what was weak, what was serious and what was naive, what a nation owed its people and what its people owed it in return, that framework was still there. But something load-bearing inside it had given way, and the structure was no longer distributing weight the way it once had. She did not speak about this to anyone except Burgett. And even with Burgett she spoke carefully, in the measured way of someone who is thinking aloud rather than reporting a conclusion she has already reached. What she found herself doing, in the days after the cart, was watching differently. Before, she had watched with the specific intention of finding the gap between surface and reality. Looking for the moment when the professional manner slipped, when the kindness revealed its transactional foundation, when the abundance turned out to be theater. She had been watching as a prosecutor watches, building a case for a conclusion she had already decided on. Now she watched without agenda. It was an unfamiliar way of seeing. She had not realized, until she tried to stop doing it, How completely her observation had been shaped by what she was looking for. How the mind in service of a fixed conclusion becomes a remarkably efficient instrument for finding confirming evidence, and a remarkably poor one for seeing anything else. She watched the corporal from Minnesota spend 20 minutes after the end of his shift helping a French kitchen worker repair a broken table in the mess hall, the two of them communicating entirely through gesture and the universal language of one person holding something steady while another person tightens the joint. No one had asked him to stay. His shift was finished. He stayed because the table was broken and the kitchen worker was struggling with it alone. She watched an American nurse spend her lunch hours sitting with one of the older German women in the facility, a woman from Cologne who had developed a persistent cough and who was frightened, in the particular quiet way of older people who have learned not to make demands, simply sitting beside her, not examining, not administering, just present. The nurse's German was almost non-existent. The woman's English was nothing at all. They sat together in the sunlight outside the medical building, and the nurse held the woman's hand, and that was tea. She watched a young private, perhaps 19 years old, find a stray dog that had wandered through the gate and spend the better part of an afternoon trying to determine if it belonged to anyone before finally feeding it from his own dinner tray and constructing a small shelter for it from a wooden crate behind the administrative building. The dog was still there a week later. The private visited it every evening. He had named it something she could not quite catch, a short American name, one syllable, said with the particular affection of someone who has decided that this specific animal deserves to be addressed by name. She filed all of this without the filter she had previously applied. Without the filter, what she saw was simply people. People behaving the way people behave when the system they live inside does not require them to be otherwise. People who had been shaped by a place that apparently did not ask them to calculate the return on every gesture before making it. People for whom basic decency was not a performance or a strategy, but simply the default. The thing you did because you were the kind of person who did it, and the country you came from had built that into you the way her country had built other things into her. This was the hardest part. Not seeing what they were. Seeing what it implied about what she had been. She thought about her students. In 6 years of teaching, she had shaped the minds of perhaps 300 young people. Their understanding of history, their relationship to literature, their sense of what a serious and responsible citizen looked like and owed to the nation that had produced them. She had taught them well, by the standards she had been given. She had been a good teacher by those standards, rigorous, committed, genuinely invested in the development of the minds in her classroom. She thought about what she had taught them. About the version of history she had presented as fact, about the literature she had been permitted to assign and the literature that had been removed from the curriculum before she arrived and whose absence she had accepted without examination, the way you accept the absence of something you never knew was there. About the lessons on citizenship that had organized the world into those who belonged and those who did not, those who contributed to the strength of the nation and those who subtracted from it. She thought about 300 young people who had received that education from her careful, precise, well-intentioned hands. She thought about what it meant that the hands had been well-intentioned. Whether intention provided any protection against the consequences of what those hands had built in 300 minds. She did not have an answer to this. She suspected there was no answer that was not devastating, and she was not yet in a condition to be devastated. She was still in the condition of someone who has just begun to see clearly and needs to keep seeing before she can decide what the seeing requires of her. So she filed the question in the same place she kept Klaus, compressed, contained, stored in the part of herself she did not open unless she was alone. She would open it eventually. She knew this. Some things cannot be kept compressed indefinitely. But not yet. Not here. Not until she had something to do with it besides simply hold it. The Red Cross notice arrived on a Friday morning in the second week of July. Dorothy, one of the American administrative clerks who had developed a habit of bringing the morning mail to the desks of the German women who worked in the room, a small kindness so routine by now that it had stopped registering as remarkable, set it on Kathy's desk between the stack of forms and the coffee cup with the same quiet care she used for anything she understood might matter. Kathy looked at the envelope before opening it. She had submitted 3 Red Cross inquiries about Klaus since arriving at the facility. The first 2 had returned standard acknowledgments. Your inquiry is registered, Processing times are currently extended due to the volume of displacement cases across the European theater. You will be notified when information becomes available. The language of an overwhelmed system doing its best with an impossible workload. This envelope was different. Thicker. The kind of thickness that meant more than a standard acknowledgement. She opened it with steady hands. The letter was 2 pages. The first page was administrative, dates, reference numbers, the formal language of official correspondence. She moved through it quickly, her eyes finding the information that mattered. Klaus Heinrich Vogel. Born Dresden, 1925. Last confirmed location, holding facility, British occupation zone, Western Germany. Current status, alive. Health condition, recovering from injuries sustained during final engagement, March 1945. Current medical assessment, stable. Expected transfer to repatriation processing, within 60 days. She read it 3 times. Alive. Injured but stable. Recovering. 60 days from repatriation. She set the letter down on the desk and pressed her palms flat against the surface and looked at the wall in front of her and breathed. The corporal from Minnesota looked up from his work. He had learned to read the quality of her silences too, in the way that people who share working space develop an involuntary literacy in each other's emotional states. And after a moment he said, simply, "Good news?" "My brother," she said in English. "He is alive." The corporal's expression shifted into something uncomplicated and genuine. "That's real good," he said. "I'm glad." He meant it. She could tell. He meant it the way the nurse had meant sitting with the woman from Cologne, the way Cole had meant going to get the heavier wrench. Not as a performance, not as a strategic gesture, but as a simple human response to another person's relief. She picked up the letter again. She read the second page. It contained information about the repatriation process, where Klaus would be transferred, what documentation she needed to provide, how to initiate contact through the Red Cross forwarding system. Practical information, logistical and administrative. The machinery of a system working through the enormous task of reconnecting what the war had separated. She read it carefully. Then she folded both pages back into the envelope and set it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest, and turned back to her forms. She typed for the rest of the morning with the steady, focused precision that had always been her professional signature. But something in the room felt different. Something in the way the light came through the window, or the way her hands moved on the keys, or the way the ordinary sounds of the administrative building, the corporal's papers, the distant kitchen noise, the truck moving in the yard outside, registered in her awareness. Lighter. The room felt lighter. She did not identify this out loud. She simply worked and breathed and allowed the fact of Klaus being alive to exist alongside everything else she was carrying. The 300 students, the missing framework, the card in the rain, the shelf with no lock she had heard about from one of the other women who had passed through a different facility, and found that the fact of his being alive made all of it more bearable. Not because it resolved anything, but because it meant he would be there when she needed to think through. What came next? She would write to him tonight. She would tell him what she had seen. She would begin, she thought, with a soldier named Cole and a broken cart and 40 minutes in the rain, because that was where the seeing had started for her. And because if Klaus was going to rebuild his understanding of the world he had just survived, she wanted him to start from a specific, concrete, undeniable thing rather than from an abstraction. The concrete things were the ones that lasted. She had been a teacher long enough to know that. That evening she told Burgett about the letter. Burgett said nothing for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand briefly on Kathy's arm. The same gesture Dorothy had used on the morning of the supply truck realization, the same gesture the American nurse had used with the woman from Cologne, and said, "Good. He will need you when he comes home." "Yes," Kathy said. "And you will need him." "Yes," she said again. They sat on the low wall in the July evening, the air warm now, the fields deep green, the light lasting long in the way that northern European summers hold the light, as if reluctant to let it go. Somewhere beyond the fence a farmer was working his field in the long evening, the distant sound of the work carrying faintly across the still air. Kathy thought about the letter in her jacket pocket. She thought about what she would write tonight. She thought about all the things she had seen in 2 months that she had not been prepared to see, and about what it meant to carry that seeing back to a country that would need, more than anything else, people who had seen clearly and were willing to say so. She was not sure yet what she would do with everything she knew. She was not sure what form the knowing would take when she finally brought it home. But she was sure of one thing. Sure with the particular certainty of a precise mind that has finally stopped arguing with the evidence in front of it. She had come here certain about what America was. She was leaving that certainty behind, piece by piece, cart by cart, cup of coffee by cup of coffee, 40 minutes in the rain at a time. And what was replacing it, slowly, cautiously, with all the reluctance of a woman who did not change her mind easily, was something that felt, against every expectation, like the beginning of an honest reckoning with the world as it actually was. She wrote the letter to Klaus that same night. She sat at the small table in the barracks with the lamp casting its yellow light across the page, and she wrote without stopping, the way you write when you have been holding something long enough that the holding is finally over and the words come out already formed. She did not begin with abstractions. She had been a teacher long enough to know that abstractions slide off a mind that is not yet ready for them. She began with something specific, something a person could see. There is a soldier here named Cole. He is perhaps 20 years old, from a town in Ohio whose name I cannot yet pronounce. 3 weeks ago I watched him from a window. An old French farmer's cart had broken down in the road outside the gate. One of the rear wheels had come off the axle. The farmer was trying to fix it alone and could not manage it. Cole was on gate duty. He had no obligation to this man. The farmer was not his concern, not his responsibility, not connected to his situation in any way that would benefit Cole by helping him. There was no audience. No one was keeping a record. He went back inside the gate, came back with better tools, and spent 40 minutes in the rain fixing the wheel. When it was done, he picked up his tools and went back inside. That was all. No ceremony. No waiting for thanks. Just a problem on the road. A person who needed help and the obvious response. I have been trying to find the explanation for this that costs less than the truth. I have been trying for 3 weeks. I cannot find it. The truth is this. He did it because he was the kind of person who does that. And he is the kind of person who does that because the country that made him apparently builds that into people the way our country built other things into us. Not as a performance. Not a strategy. As the simple default of a society that trusts its people to be decent and has been trusting them long enough that the decency has become ordinary. I want you to think about that word, Klaus. Ordinary. Think about what it means when simple human decency is so ordinary that a 20-year-old from Ohio does not even register it as a choice. He fixed the cart because of course you fixed the cart. Because what kind of person walks past a broken cart and an old man in the rain? The kind of person we were told they were. That is who we were told they were. They are not that. Asterisk. She paused. She looked at what she had written. Then she continued. Come home safely. Come home and let us talk about what we rebuild and what we build it from. I have seen some things here that I think you need to hear. Not because America is perfect. I am a schoolteacher and I do not believe anything is perfect. But because there are ideas here worth understanding. About what a country owes its people. About what happens when a society decides that decency is ordinary rather than exceptional. We have work to do. I want you beside me when we begin it. Your sister, who is learning to see clearly, slowly, and later than she should have, but honestly. She folded the letter, sealed it, set it on the table for posting in the morning. She turned off the lamp. Repatriation came in the last week of August. On the morning of her departure, Kathy stood in the yard with her small bag and her documents and looked at the facility one final time. The stone farmhouse, the outbuildings, the gravel yard, the gate where Cole had walked through with his tools on a rainy Wednesday in June. The corporal from Minnesota was there to process the departing women. When Kathy reached his table, he checked her documents, stamped her repatriation card, and handed it back. Then he looked up and said, in careful German he had clearly been practicing, Gut Reise. Safe travels. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. In English, meaning it completely. He nodded. He called the next name. She walked through the gate and did not look back. She returned to a Germany that was learning, slowly and painfully, to look at itself honestly. She found Klaus 4 months later, thinner, quieter, but alive, sitting in the kitchen of a borrowed apartment in what remained of their city with the serious expression she had known his whole life. She told him about Cole, about the cart, about 40 minutes in the rain and a man who went to get better tools, because that was simply what you did. Klaus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That is the kind of country I want to help build." She thought about the corporal from Minnesota, about Burgett on the low wall, about the nurse holding an old woman's hand in the sunlight, about the shelf with no lock, and the prayer for Friedrich she had heard about from another woman, and the supply truck with its unremarkable abundance signed for on an ordinary Tuesday. She thought about a people who had decided, somewhere in their founding, that decency was not a reward for good behavior, but a starting condition. That every person on the road deserved the obvious response. "Yes," she said to Klaus. "So do I."